October 1962 was the closest the world has ever come to total nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a tense standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, lasted 13 days, yet every moment held the potential to end human civilization. In our timeline, careful diplomacy and measured restraint prevented disaster. But what if a single decision had gone differently? What if the tension escalated into a full-scale nuclear war? Imagine the consequences. Missiles launched, cities destroyed, millions of lives wiped out in hours. Entire nations plunged into chaos. The Cold War would no longer be a distant threat. It would become a global nightmare that changed everything. Stay with this story to see how the world would have been reshaped forever, how human society would struggle to survive, and how the modern world would look after such a catastrophe. By the end, you'll understand just how close we came and how fragile civilization really is. The divergence begins on October 27, 1962, a day history remembers as Black Saturday. A U-2 reconnaissance plane flying over Cuba detects Soviet missile activity. In reality, the situation was tense but manageable, and both sides exercised restraint. In this alternate timeline, the pilot misinterprets Soviet anti-aircraft fire as the beginning of an attack and urgently reports to Washington. With tensions already at their peak, the U.S. leadership interprets the signal as confirmation of an imminent strike against American forces. President John F. Kennedy orders a preemptive nuclear strike on Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Within minutes, the Soviets detect incoming missiles and interpret it as an attack on their homeland. Moscow authorizes an immediate counterstrike, sending nuclear warheads toward U.S. targets in Florida, Washington, and strategic military installations. Within hours, explosions ripple across the globe. Cities in Cuba and the U.S. are obliterated, and the first true global nuclear exchange begins. The question becomes immediate. How does humanity survive when the first domino has fallen? This initial misstep triggers a chain reaction that no negotiation or compromise can stop. The stage is set for a world in which the concept of limited war disappears entirely. The first hours are chaos. Havana is obliterated, along with every nearby military installation and infrastructure hub. Hundreds of thousands die instantly, while radiation spreads across the Caribbean. Florida faces similar devastation. Cities like Miami and Key West are flattened, leaving survivors scrambling for food, water, and shelter amid the fires and rubble. The Soviet Union retaliates immediately. Missile sites in Turkey, NATO military bases in Europe, and strategic locations in Eastern Europe are hit. Western Europe experiences a sudden and terrifying escalation. Panic spreads as governments struggle to communicate and maintain order. Diplomacy collapses within hours. Leaders must make impossible decisions to strike, to defend, or to retreat. The concept of a controlled conflict evaporates. In Asia, China and India watch anxiously. Pakistan mobilizes defensively, while Japan prepares emergency measures to protect its population. Even neutral nations such as Switzerland, Sweden, and Canada face fallout. Radiation drifts unpredictably across continents, creating invisible threats. The entire world has become a battlefield, even in regions far from the initial explosions. This is only the beginning. The full impact of a global nuclear war will unfold over the coming days, months, and years. Humanity is on the brink, and survival will demand unimaginable sacrifices. The global political landscape changes immediately. The United Nations convenes emergency sessions, but communication lines are destroyed. Cities are irradiated, and key leaders are dead or incapacitated. Superpower diplomacy collapses. Alliances fracture under the pressure of survival as countries scramble to protect their own populations. Europe becomes a patchwork of chaos. NATO's structure disintegrates as European nations face fallout from attacks on US and Soviet bases. Governments in Italy, Germany, and the United Kingdom struggle to maintain control as cities are partially destroyed, refugees flood borders, and basic infrastructure collapses. The Soviet Union, reeling from US attacks and facing massive internal casualties, loses its centralized control over some territories. In Asia, China sees an opportunity to expand influence while defending against potential nuclear strikes from India or Pakistan. Africa, largely spared from initial strikes, becomes a hub for refugees and displaced populations. However, famine, disease, and economic collapse soon follow as global trade halts and supply chains fail. The modern world order as we know it ceases to exist. The immediate political fallout raises the question, will any form of governance survive? Humanity teeters on the edge of not just war, but societal collapse. As the full scale of destruction begins to unfold, the viewer is invited to engage. If you want to see how human society struggles to survive this unprecedented catastrophe, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. The next stages of this alternate history will show a world unrecognizable from our own. The days and weeks after the initial strikes are marked by an unprecedented environmental disaster. The massive detonations release soot and debris into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and plunging the planet into a nuclear winter. Global temperatures drop, crops fail, and famine spreads across continents. Even regions far from direct attacks experience food shortages and rising mortality. Societies struggle to maintain order. Cities are abandoned, governments collapse, and infrastructure fails. Power grids, communication systems, and transportation networks vanish. People form small, isolated communities, relying on scavenging and subsistence farming. Lawlessness spreads in some areas, while other communities develop strict survivalist structures. Medical knowledge and technology regress. Hospitals, research centers, and universities are destroyed, leaving survivors with only limited understanding of how to deal with radiation sickness, famine, and disease. Cultural knowledge is preserved in fragments, often through oral tradition or hidden caches. Civilization teeters on the brink of extinction. Even amid this darkness, some pockets of humanity endure. Small communities cling to life, forming rudimentary societies that must adapt quickly or perish. How these survivors organize themselves will shape the long-term trajectory of human civilization. Decades later, the survivors of nuclear war inhabit a radically different world. The United States and the Soviet Union, former superpowers, are shadows of their former selves. Large portions of Europe and Asia are permanently uninhabitable, and the global population is drastically reduced. Nations that survive function as isolated city-states or small federations. Borders are fluid, defined more by survival needs than political agreements. Society changes profoundly. Technology exists, but knowledge is limited to essentials for survival. Electricity, computers, and transportation networks are rare or non-functional. Farming, hunting, and basic craftsmanship dominate daily life. Knowledge becomes power, and communities value memory and oral history over written records. Culture shifts as well. Religion and superstition rise, filling the void left by collapsed institutions. Art and storytelling focus on survival, history, and morality. Languages evolve differently in isolated communities, and old global norms are forgotten. Political power is localized, and trust between communities is minimal. Global cooperation is a memory, replaced by pragmatic alliances and competition for resources. Even as humanity endures, the scars of nuclear war remain permanent. The experience reshapes human behavior, culture, and political strategy for generations. The question remains, could the world ever rebuild a global civilization? Or is isolation the only path to survival? By the equivalent of 2025 in this alternate timeline, the modern world is barely recognizable. Megacities are rare, fortified, and few. Most human populations live in scattered communities, often separated by hundreds of miles of uninhabitable terrain. Climate change, compounded by nuclear winter effects, has permanently altered weather patterns and agricultural viability. Crop failures are common, and famine remains a constant threat. Technology survives in isolated pockets. Some communities maintain knowledge of electricity, basic computers, and medical techniques, while others revert entirely to pre-industrial life. Communication between settlements is rare and difficult, often relying on long-distance messengers rather than any centralized system. Travel and trade are limited to what humans can achieve without modern infrastructure. Global politics are virtually non-existent. Former nations exist in name only. Most interactions are local, and alliances are temporary and pragmatic. Trust is scarce, and the memory of nuclear war makes any perceived threat catastrophic. Survival takes precedence over ideology, and every decision is weighed against the risk of annihilation. Even in this devastated world, life persists. Humans adapt, survive, and rebuild, but the shadow of nuclear war never fades. The cost of the Cuban Missile Crisis escalating into full-scale nuclear war is permanent, shaping not just history, but the very conditions of human existence. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a chilling reminder of how close humanity has come to self-destruction. In this alternate timeline, a single misstep triggered a chain reaction that reshaped the planet, decimated populations, and erased the modern world as we know it. It is a story of fragility, of how human civilization balances on a knife's edge. If this vision of history fascinated or terrified you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more alternate histories, what-if scenarios, and explorations of human decision-making at the edge of catastrophe. Every choice matters, and history is never as fixed as it seems. The world we know exists because restraint prevailed. But what if it hadn't?